crisis of the church, represented by the Great Schism in Babylonian captivity, though was not sufficient in itself to overthrow the basic structure of the universal Catholic confession in Europe. Before that ultimate revolution, the Reformation, could happen, there needed to be other factors at work, things that not only challenged the basic confessional allegiance of thousands of adherents, but also provided an alternative, another intellectual structure, another model that could be put in the place of the universal Catholic confession. And what we need to see now is exactly how that religious perspective developed. How, in fact, the humanist movement in Italy could move from a largely secular confession to a largely religious one. How, in fact, the ideas that developed in the peculiar environment of Florence and the Italian city-state could then be moved into the large territorial monarchies of the north, where feudalism still had deep roots, where concepts still were sustained, concepts in which there was primacy of birth and in which there was almost a complete identification between religious, intellectual, and cultural authority. And to do that, we in fact have to look at how the crisis of the church began to influence those north of the Alps and began to force them to reassess some of the basic assumptions that they had about the nature of religion itself and the nature of the relationship between the individual believer and the structure of the church. I mentioned when we talked about the rise of heretical groups, John Huss being the most powerful of all of them. But when the rise of these heretical movements, I said there were many, and most of them had characteristics that had elements of similarity and always tended to be linked to this idea of the individual believer in contradistinction to, or even in opposition to, the organized ecclesiology, the organized structure of the church. And in Northern Europe, these movements, in fact, began to proliferate and became increasingly powerful. And they began not just as movements of the faithful, but increasingly became influenced by humanism itself, but humanism in its northern or Christian form. So Christian humanism and elements of lay piety formed a very, very powerful critique of the Roman Church, and again provided one of the necessary preconditions for ultimately the success of the Reformation in Germany. Many of the movements that began to arise during the period of the Babylonian captivity and schism were directed towards allowing the individual to have a closer relationship with God and not be restrained by or not have to pass through or be controlled and regulated by a closed caste of priests operating through the church. If there was a mechanism by which the individual could approach God directly, rather than through the sacramental operation of the Roman Church or through the mediation of a priest, then in fact many of the problems inherent in the Babylonian captivity and the schism would disappear. Because regardless who was Pope, as long as the individual had a close relationship with Christ and God, then there shouldn't be any difficulty. Then that serious crisis of conscience that the schism precipitated would then in fact begin to melt away. So there arose, especially in Northern Europe, and again especially in the fringes of Northern Europe, such as the Low Countries as well as Bohemia, movements of lay piety that were non-sacramental. In other words, they were based upon either the idea of trying to follow Christ's example or in groups of individuals who lived together in a way to ensure that they would be able to live lives they believed to be pleasing to God and not necessarily have to be regulated by the structure and organization of the Roman Church. During the early Middle Ages, because of this connection of, in fact, almost an exact identification between learning and education and the ecclesiastical order, the First Estate, there was this very, very indissoluble link between learning and religion. Italy, exemplified by Florence and even in the model of Petrarch himself, successfully separated these things. You, in fact, could be a humanist and believe strongly in pagan authors and follow their examples and still be a devout Christian, as were Petrarch and almost all of the great humanists in Italy. But in the north, things were a bit more complicated. This possibility to separate and divide the secular daily life from the religious and spiritual life didn't really exist. because there was no tradition of lay education. There was no tradition really of a lay culture in the church whatsoever, the way there had been in Rome and in Florence and in other places. So this connection then was something that provided really an advantage almost for those in the North who were looking for an intellectual model that would give both spiritual fulfillment and some measure of comfort, and intellectual fulfillment and comfort as well. So the establishment of Christian humanism or Northern humanism, based upon the vehicles and instruments and skills of humanism as developed in Italy, but applied to different texts and different ideas, became the characteristic of humanism in the North. Well, what do I mean by that, and how did it work? In Italy, when humanism developed, the skills such as editing of manuscripts, such as the ability to understand correct Latin, philology, textual editing, all of these skills were applied largely to pagan texts, to texts that came out of the Roman Empire and later ancient Greece. They were to understand how the ancient world worked, so that those laymen in the Italian cities could then learn the moral lives of these individuals to apply to their own secular lives. Their religious and spiritual lives, they left to the structure of the church. It was separate, it was different. But in the North, because this separation was impossible, the skills that had been developed in Italy to deal with ancient secular texts like Cicero were applied to religious texts. And in fact, the most important of the ancient authors weren't Cicero and Virgil and Ovid and Horace. No, they were St. Jerome and St. Augustine and the other patristic authors, those fathers of the church that had not only written superb Latin, but also, in fact, had given shape to early Christianity. So the skill set of humanism was applied then to religious texts. And the ultimate religious text, of course, was the Bible, the effects of which we shall see in a moment. This union then of a desire for spiritual regeneration, of spiritual comfort outside the structure of the church, and the desire for learning can best be exemplified in the Brethren of the Common Life. In the middle of the 14th century, a man from the Low Countries named Gerhard Grota established this order according to a set of principles that he called the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion. And this was to separate this Devotio Moderna, this modern devotion, from the Devotio Antiqua, which was in fact the rule of St. Benedict and the other monastic orders that characterized Roman Christianity. This then was not a group of individuals who were linked by a monastic rule or by monastic practice. These were a group of individuals, both men and women, who chose to live together freely in communities and practice certain values and principles, and also to live a life that they believed would be beneficial for the salvation of their souls, regardless what was going on in the established church. Consequently, the Brethren of the Common Life not only established an element of moral rectitude and an element of spirituality, they also established the best schools in Northern Europe. Schools that were boarding schools, schools in which humanism could be applied to classical texts of both kinds, both pagan and Christian, but the emphasis was always on the revealed, on the Christian. The reason for this is that they could not separate what they saw as the most important function of human life, and that is achieving salvation, from their learning. Italians could manage because of the continuation of secular education. In the North, because that condition did not exist, there was no way of separating the secular from the divine. The two came together in a powerful union that was to have the most dramatic results. One example should be enough to indicate how powerful this Northern Christian humanism could be, especially as taught in their fine schools. And that was the example of Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam. Erasmus, the Prince of Humanists, perhaps the greatest of all the Northern or Christian humanists, was born about 1466. We don't really know because he kept putting his birth date earlier and earlier, as he was the illegitimate son of a priest, and he wanted to have been at least conceived before his father took major orders. So we're not quite sure when he was born. We do know that he died in 1536. Erasmus was born in Rotterdam and was soon made an orphan because of the plague. And he was then sent to the brethren of the common life for his education. And there he learned not just the deep spirituality of these followers of Gerhard Grota, not the spiritual communion that he felt in this free association of individuals looking for salvation in a secular environment, but also he learned so much because of the excellence of their schools, and his ability to learn, and especially his facility with classical languages, quickly made him a star. To some extent, he peaked early, and he was identified as someone who really should enter the clergy. His guardians required him to enter a monastery. He took priest's orders and ultimately became a member of a religious order. Not completely willingly, but there really wasn't much alternative for him given the conditions of his life, although ultimately he had the Pope release him from his religious vows. Erasmus not only worried about his own salvation, which was a constant theme in his writings about how, in fact, he could solve that problem of Christianity, of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem, but also he, like so many other leaders of intellectual revolutions, took his own solution and made it a model for others to follow. And that is, these things are not mutually exclusive. You, in fact, can have a mind sensitized and, in fact, polished by secular learning and still have that mind most attracted to and devoted to the idea of religious salvation. And in his own life, he practiced this very, very effectively. And his writings, which not only made him very, very famous, but also were the most popular works in Northern Europe, works that not only popularized the ancient tags of the Latin language, but also provided moral lessons in books like the Adagia. In these writings, Erasmus began to identify not just what he saw are some of the solutions, but also some of the problems. In the solution category, there was perhaps his Enchiridion Militis Christiani of 1503. This handbook of the Christian knight was a discussion of how each individual Christian is fighting a battle of the soul, and the best instruments in this war are prayer and belief and faith. These kinds of things made him extremely popular amongst those that were looking for a confessional literature to provide some measure of personal comfort in a difficult time. But he wrote other things that in some ways were much more revolutionary, which actually attracted the attention of those who thought that he had crossed the line and moved from works of pietistic enlightenment to works that were essentially heretical. One of the most famous books of the 16th century is The Praise of Folly, the Moriae Encomium, actually a pun on the name of his very close friend Thomas More. The Moriae Encomium, The Praise of Folly, is a lecture given by Folly in which Folly praises certain things and certain men in certain categories. And this highly satirical, still very funny book was directed against priests who were ignorant or priests who were superstitious, against proud prelates and popes and bishops, and monks who were anything but religious and anything but practitioners of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This attack, this satirical, hilarious, pointed, barbed attack on so many of the structures of the church gave Erasmus the reputation of being somebody who was willing to challenge not just the status quo, but work with the structure of European society and find alternatives to the model that was placed before him. That was revolutionary enough. That got him into a certain amount of trouble. But in 1516, he perhaps threw down the greatest challenge to the established church. He did a new translation of the New Testament, his Novum Instrumentum. The old translation was, of course, the translation of St. Jerome, and this Vulgate was the accepted version of the Roman Church, and St. Jerome was identified as a doctor of the Church and worthy of veneration in himself. Erasmus used as many Greek manuscripts as he could find, and through his very deep knowledge of Greek and his philological skills, did a new translation. And the translation was revolutionary because it showed two things. It showed first that Jerome was guilty of errors in translation, and at least one instance, one of the sacraments of the church was informed by this error in translation. And secondly, Erasmus chose different words. He used his thesaurus in another way. In the Gospel of John, St. Jerome wrote, "In principio erat verbum." In the beginning was the Word. Verbum means word, that is, collection of letters. Erasmus translated that critical text, "In principio erat sermo." In the beginning was speech, connecting this idea to humanism and the power of rhetoric and the power of speech to transform. This kind of thing, directed precisely against the very foundation, the theological platform of Christianity, was more than a great many churchmen could bear, and Erasmus just barely escaped because of his fame being charged with heresy. 1516 then was an extremely important date for Christian humanism. It was a date in which the fundamental basic text of Christianity, the New Testament, could in fact be questioned. And Erasmus, being Erasmus, went one step further. He wrote an introduction to it. And that introduction again challenged the church, because he said that he hoped that he would be able to hear the plowboy singing the Psalms walking behind his plow. In other words, that the Bible should be made available, even in the vernacular, to all, including simple men and women. This year, 1516, was critical for a number of reasons. It was critical because the closest friend that Erasmus had in the world, someone with whom he had been so close since 1499, was the English lawyer and statesman and Christian humanist Thomas More. More was a humanist, a scholar who had been to Oxford. More was a man who was originally going to be a monk, a Carthusian, and throughout the entirety of his life wore a hair shirt. A man who said that he married because he would rather be a good husband than an impure priest. A man who ultimately believed sufficiently in the structure of the church that he was willing to die for it and become a martyr in 1535. But the More that we need to investigate and meet is not just the famous lawyer, the under-sheriff of London, the man who became Lord Chancellor to Henry VIII, the man who gave Henry VIII so many of his theological ideas and perhaps wrote much of Henry VIII's assertion of the seven sacraments against Luther. The More that we need to meet is partly that man, but partly the author of probably the most important book written in the 16th century, the Utopia. More's Utopia is one of the books of that century that is continually being reread and reinterpreted. It too appeared in 1516, that annus mirabilis of Christian humanism. And if we look at what it is, we again see the challenge that was being thrown up against the fundamental structures of Europe as it was then established. More's Utopia purports to be the discovery of an island, in Greek it means nowhere, no place, by one of the sailors that had gone with Amerigo Vespucci. And this discovery of an island made another model of political, social, economic, and confessional arrangement possible. This imaginary world, because it started the whole genre of utopian literature, this model was very different from the one that More knew, and knew intimately as a statesman and somebody directly involved in politics and diplomacy. Because on Utopia, there was a prince, but this prince, in fact, was carefully educated, and this prince was regulated. Society was not as he knew it, in which the powerful could do what they wanted and the poor suffered as a consequence. This was a world of communism, where all things are held in common, where there is no private property. This isn't the communism of Karl Marx. It's the communism of the Apostolic Church. It's the world in which greed, and particularly the world in which individual ambition would be controlled by the community. And most importantly, it's a world, and this is, I think, the key to what More was saying, it's a world in which charity could operate because property and power would be distributed in such a way as to ensure that good would always triumph over evil, where violence would be contained, where the most educated and learned would rule society, where there was no huge distinction between wealth and poverty, between power and impotence. What More was saying then in this book was to provide an alternate model of the human condition. It was a fundamental challenge to the whole structure and directed precisely at the heart of the received world which he inhabited. Moore then was revolutionary as well, and it's again not an accident that 1516 was the year of its publication. And it's also not an accident, as we'll see, that it was the year before the Lutheran Revolution, and we're seeing the preconditions for that revolution being deeply established. Men like Moore and Erasmus were then challenging the structure of society by using the very powers of that society and its intellectual organization in order to challenge and to call into disrepute and to ask for solutions to and ask questions about the whole nature of the received world, of the way things were, and the assumptions that everyone was making. It was driven by not just the desire to understand and to believe, to find a solution to spiritual problems, but it was also a desire that firmly believed that if you found a solution to these spiritual and personal problems, you would find a solution to the political and social and economic problems as well. It's not an accident that utopia is founded on the principle of charity, because this huge monastery that constituted utopia was a place in which charity had to operate because of the structure in which people lived. Moore is suggesting that if you change the structure of society, and in particular you change the structure of the moral engine of that society, which is the church, then perhaps things might look different. Moore and Erasmus reached to some extent the same conclusion, that you had to make fundamental alterations of the individual soul and spirit of individual Christians, but then also you had to challenge the institutions in which these individuals live. So what we see then is a fundamental challenge to the nature of the world as these Christian humanists found it. And it was now up to the established order to respond, to try and come up with solutions on their own that would allow these things to actually happen, or to reject them and to repress them and to drive them back into the underground where many thought they actually should always have existed. Revolution then happens not only led by a hero on a horse waving a sword, or by a leader who seems to crystallize what other people are thinking. Revolutions have deep roots, and for revolutions to succeed, those roots must in fact have very, very complex connections with the organic structure of a society. Moreover, for revolutions to succeed, there must be alternatives in place. You have to have something that will be put in place of what you want to change. And that is what the Christian humanists were doing. They were experimenting with different models. Just as the Italian humanists and the Italian city-states experimented with different social, political, and economic models, the Christian humanists were looking at different religious, ecclesiastical, personal, confessional, and social and political models as well. For the revolution to happen then, these organic roots had to be put deep. They also had to spread widely. And to whom were these books directed? Who read Utopia? Who read Erasmus? Increasingly, they were being read by that same group of learned urban dwellers, those townsmen who had been cut off from the traditions of feudal and manorial society by the very existence of their lives, by their occupations, by their social structure, and by the political and economic world in which they lived. So the audience was an audience receptive to change, an audience that had already experienced change, and now were looking for the alternative, who were looking for a model, who were looking for an ideology, who were looking for an overarching set of principles to use to replace what clearly for them no longer worked. They no longer found the church comforting because a Latin Mass and the sacramental nature of Catholicism didn't do it for them. They were no longer content to accept the being despised by an illiterate nobleman simply because he had the good fortune to be born between the right pair of sheets, while they made the fortune that made his life possible. They were no longer willing to accept that. They were beginning to question whether, in fact, the nature of society and the church as it was best for them, and consequently, perhaps, it could be improved for others as well. It was not enough to have large numbers of individuals, this growing mercantile urban class, highly educated, very sophisticated, looking for new models. There had to be another element as well, and that's to make sure those models were clearly defined and readily available. At the beginning of the 15th century, there was born in Germany a remarkable man named Johann Gutenberg. And by 1450, this remarkable man had perfected the use of movable type. That is, metal type to be used to print books that could then cheaply, effectively, and extremely reliably make books and ideas available to huge numbers of people. Why was this so important? What connection was there? Well, as we've seen, we have so many individuals who are looking for new models. We have a large number of individuals who are offering new models. But how to put them together? Printing put them together. Printing allowed these new examples of how society might be organized and the nature of the critique to be put before a reading audience that was looking for things, that were searching for an important solution to the fundamental issues and problems they identified in their lives and in society at large. Printing made the ideas of Moore and Erasmus available to anyone who could read, and relatively cheaply, and, as is so important, reliably. Manuscripts are full of errors. When you copy by hand one book onto a blank page, you make mistakes. You change it depending on what you think. You interpolate things. But printing, especially printing a book by someone like Erasmus, who oversaw the actual production of so many of his books, he was so intent that they be done correctly. You know that Erasmus's ideas are the same, and so people across Europe are debating the same things in the same vocabulary, the same problems identified and the same solutions proposed. Printing then becomes, to some extent, the secret weapon of change, because it becomes the vehicle by which large numbers of people can be mobilized and alternatives can be put in place in order to challenge society, regardless how powerful that society is or how much it's part of the collective unconscious, the DNA of a people. Once you have new ideas and those ideas are clearly formulated, then debate can happen. And if the debate cannot be held by one side or another, there will be change, and change indeed happened. Not even the crisis in the church, not even the horrors of the Babylonian captivity, or the absurdity of the Great Schism, or the humiliation of the church represented by these papal difficulties, in fact, could mobilize the souls, spirits, imaginations, and minds of Northern Europeans the way printing could put in place a set of alternatives that could lead to true revolution. There was, in fact, a psychological shock. The psychological shock of the Great Schism, the changes that were taking place in society because of urbanization and the rise of a money economy, other shocks that we will talk about in subsequent lectures, such as the Ottoman threat to Europe and the discovery of the New World, that had dramatic, powerful effects on the European imagination, on the European experience. All of these things happened as part of a context. But the individual core was the recognition that society was not working very well, that there were large numbers of people, influential people, articulate people, powerful people in as much as they controlled ideas, who in fact felt outside the structure of the European world as it was then formulated according to the traditions of the Middle Ages. That revolution, in fact, would ultimately manifest itself again in the acts of the Reformation and in so much of the state building that constituted the recreation of large territorial dynastic monarchies where once there had been feudal kingdoms and the fragmentation of power. In the next lecture, we're going to look at Europe to some extent from not without, but look at a threat from without that galvanized much of the European mentality. The Ottoman threat, the success of the Turks, the loss of the Mediterranean in many ways to the Turks, meant that Europe felt under siege, threatened. And what's more, the Turks were infidels from the point of view of Christians. What was God doing? What's happening? So that God is giving victory to these invincible Turks. What is God saying to Christians? What's going on? What is the context? And how are we as European Christians supposed to deal with this crisis? The Ottoman threat to Europe then wasn't just the threat to trade, wasn't just the driving force behind the voyages of discovery and the shifting of the economic and political center north of the Alps. It had a fundamental effect on the psyche of Europeans. It was a threat that was so profound that Christian Europeans were forced to reevaluate what they really believed to be true and how they could identify so many of the problems and difficulties that they had. And perhaps what they're suggesting is some of those solutions, some of the things suggested by Moore and Erasmus and others, might in fact be much better protection from God's anger represented by the Turks, and perhaps to create new institutions that were not only more pleasing to God, but more effective for a happy European population and for a secure and stable life.